In 1086, William the Conqueror ordered a survey of everything England contained: every manor, every field, every mill, every owner. The Domesday Book records what the conquest actually produced: a country systematically transferred name by name into Norman hands. Some of those names are still carried today by people who have never considered what they mean. This list ranks the 10 Norman surnames that altered England most permanently, by the land they took, the institutions they shaped, and the consequences they set in motion that were not finished when their families were. The list grows heavier as it descends. Most English surnames that feel native to this island, rooted, unquestioned, as English as the soil beneath a churchyard, are not English at all. They are Norman French place names carried across 22 miles of water in the autumn of 1066 by armed men who stayed. The conquest did not only change who sat on the English throne, it changed what English people are called. Millions carry the proof in their own names, on their passports, above their front doors, without knowing it. This list ranks 10 of those surnames by the depth of the mark they left on English land, English law, English power, and the long, slow making of a country that still lives inside what they built and what they broke. The entries grow heavier as the list descends, the scale of consequence increases. And the name waiting at number 1 helped write the document that became the foundation of English constitutional law, conquered a country across the Irish Sea, and then died on a Scottish battlefield, leaving behind a legal scar that English property law still carries. If your surname appears somewhere in this list, you are not simply carrying a family name. You are carrying a border. Number 10. Warren. The name sounds unmistakably English. Quiet, pastoral, the kind of surname that suggests deep roots in English soil. It began, in fact, as a strip of Norman land pressed into a single word and carried across the Channel by a man who fought his way into English history. William de Warenne crossed with the Conqueror in 1066 and fought at Hastings. Within 2 years of that battle, he held estates recorded across at least 11 English counties. The Domesday Survey of 1086 fixed his landholdings in permanent record, a Norman commander's reward written into the foundational census of England. The family became Earls of Surrey, one of the earliest earldoms created by William after the conquest, and their principal English seat rose at Conisbrough in Yorkshire. The great circular tower of Conisbrough Castle still stands. It is the oldest surviving Norman great tower of its kind in England. Pale stone above the River Don, built by Hamelin de Warenne in the late 12th century, as solid now as the century it was raised. The 6th Earl, John de Warenne, gave the Warenne name one of its most remembered moments. When Edward I demanded that the Earl produce his legal title to his lands, part of a broader royal effort to audit baronial claims, de Warenne reportedly produced a rusty sword. By this instrument, he told the king's commissioners, "Did my ancestors acquire their lands? By it I shall defend them." The story, recorded by later chroniclers, may carry the weight of legend. The defiance it describes was entirely characteristic of the Norman baronial class that Warren represents. The male line ended in 1347, when John de Warenne, 7th Earl, died without legitimate heirs. The earldom dissolved. The name did not. Here is the detail that earns Warren its place on this list, beyond the castles and the earldom. The word warren in modern English meaning a managed enclosure for rabbits or small game, a protected hunting ground, a landscape deliberately kept for pursuit. That word and the surname Warren are the same word. Both derive from the same Norman French root, warren, a preserved hunting ground, a territory held and defended. The surname and the common noun diverged from a single source. When you describe a warren of tunnels or a rabbit warren beneath a field, you are using a piece of Norman French that has been in the English language since 1066. Conisbrough Castle stands today in South Yorkshire, maintained by English Heritage. The surname Warren is now among the most widely distributed in England, the United States, and Australia, carried by people with no knowledge of the Domesday Survey that first recorded it. No awareness of the circular tower above the River Don, no sense that they are holding in their own name a fragment of the Norman world. The Warrens established the template this list will follow: a Norman place name, an English earldom, a line that eventually ended, and a name that refused to go with it. The surname at number 9 followed the same opening arc, but left a far heavier mark on the English north and a line that, against every historical expectation, has not ended yet. Number 9, Percy. For 4 centuries, the Percy family were not merely powerful in the English north. They were, in practical terms, a second crown, holding the ragged frontier between England and Scotland with a force that no distant king in Westminster could easily override or ignore. The name originates at Percy en Auge in Calvados, Normandy. William de Percy crossed with the Conqueror and received lands in Yorkshire in the years immediately following Hastings. Within 2 generations, the family had moved north and settled at the edge of the English world, Northumberland, the county that pressed hardest against Scotland, where the land itself was a military question. They built Alnwick Castle on the River Alne, and they did not leave. Alnwick has been the Percy seat for over 700 years, the longest continuous occupation of any castle by a single English family in the historical record. The Percys led or provoked 3 major rebellions against English kings. In 1403, Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, commemorated by Shakespeare in Henry IV Part 1, led an armed rising against Henry IV and died at the Battle of Shrewsbury on the 21st of July at approximately 39 years of age. At the height of Percy power in the 15th century, the family could field an estimated 3,000 armed retainers, a private army larger than many European principalities could muster from their entire territories. The 7th Earl of Northumberland was executed in 1572 for his role in the rising of the North against Elizabeth I. His head was displayed above the gates of York, one fact that most visitors to Alnwick Castle do not register. The exterior of Alnwick Castle served as the filming location for Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in the early Harry Potter films. The most watched Norman castle on Earth, seen by hundreds of millions of people in cinemas across the world, and almost none of them knew what they were looking at. A Percy stronghold, 700 years of border warfare, dressed as a school for children. The Dukes of Northumberland still hold Alnwick today. The current Duke is the 12th. The Percy line, after nearly 1,000 years, has not ended. If your name is Percy, you carry a name that has survived every rebellion, every execution, every political miscalculation that should have erased it, and is still held intact by the family that carried it across the Channel in 1066. The Percys endured through force of will and strategic survival. The family at number 8 had every advantage the Percys possessed, and disappeared from English noble records entirely. Their absence is, in its own way, more revealing than any continuity. Number 8, Beaumont. Robert de Beaumont fought at Hastings, became the first Earl of Leicester, and was by any contemporary measure one of the most consequential men in post-conquest England, and almost no one now remembers his name. The name originates at Beaumont-le-Roger in the Eure department of Normandy. Beaumont, in Norman French, beautiful hill. It is a landscape description, the kind of name given to a place where someone once stood and looked out over something worth keeping. Robert de Beaumont brought it across the Channel in 1066 and planted it in the English Midlands, where it took root for just over a century before quietly disappearing. At Hastings, Robert de Beaumont commanded the right flank of the Norman line. Contemporary accounts note the discipline of his cavalry charge with a specificity that suggests his conduct was remarked upon even at the time. Not as a flourish, but as a controlled, professional maneuver in the middle of a battle that could have gone in either direction. William rewarded him accordingly. The Earldom of Leicester was one of the earliest post-conquest titles created, a grant of land and judicial authority in the English Midlands that made Beaumont, in practical terms, a regional sovereign answering only to the king. He served as counselor to both William I and William II. When he died around 1104, the inheritance passed to his twin sons, Robert and Walleran, born around 1104, among the earliest recorded twin births in English noble genealogy. The arrangement seemed logical. Robert would hold England, Walleran would hold Normandy. The inheritance would not diminish, it would expand across the Channel. It did not expand, it divided. Walleran de Beaumont, Count of Moulins, was captured at the Battle of Bourg-the-Roule in 1124, a Norman royalist defeat that marked the beginning of Beaumont decline on the French side of the water. In England, the family held on, But without the Normandy anchor, the English Beaumont line contracted. It died in the Mail line in 1204. The earldom of Leicester passed through several hands, was absorbed into the crown, and was eventually granted to Simon de Montfort, the man who used it as the platform from which he convened the first English Parliament in 1265. The Beaumonts' disappearance made that possible. Their vacant earldom became the lever that reshaped English constitutional history. They are absent from the story of Parliament's origins, and yet they are the reason the story happened where it did. The name Beaumont, that Norman hillside carried across the sea, survives today not primarily as a surname in English records, but as a place name across the Atlantic. There are towns called Beaumont in Texas, in California, and in Alberta, Canada. All of them trace their nomenclature through layers of settlement and migration, back to the same Norman-French route that Robert de Beaumont carried to Hastings. The beautiful hill distributed across a continent. The ruins of Leicester Abbey stand today in a public park in the city. There is no Beaumont monument there, no marker noting that the line which began on a Norman hillside ended quietly in these English Midlands. If your surname is Beaumont, what you carry is not the memory of power. It is the shape of what power leaves behind when it dissolves. The Beaumonts faded by degrees, their strength diluted across a generation and a channel. The family at number 7 vanished more completely, leaving almost no architectural trace, almost no institutional legacy, and yet holding at their moment of greatest visibility a role so central to the Conquest's meaning that its absence from the record feels even now like a deliberate omission. Number 7. Giffard. Walter Giffard carried the papal banner at the Battle of Hastings, the physical object that embodied Pope Alexander II's formal blessing of William's invasion, and his name has almost entirely vanished from English historical memory. The name originates at Longueville-sur-Sea in Seine-Maritime, Normandy. The Giffard family were not obscure before the Conquest. They were established, trusted, and rewarded with a role that carried theological as well as military weight. To carry the papal banner was not a ceremonial honor assigned to a minor figure. It was a statement of proximity to the conqueror's legitimating authority, and a declaration, visible across the battlefield, that what was happening at Hastings had divine sanction behind it. Walter Giffard received land grants across 24 English counties after 1066. 24. The geographic spread of Giffard landholdings in the Domesday Survey, through Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Berkshire, and across more than 20 additional counties, suggests a level of royal trust that few Norman families matched. His grandson, Walter Giffard II, became Earl of Buckingham, one of the few formal English titles the family held. The male line ended with him around 1102 without heirs, and the earldom dissolved. What remained was land held by female lines, scattered ecclesiastical connections, and a surname that persisted in English bishops' records for 2 further centuries. Several medieval English bishops bore the name Giffard. The family's legacy, in the end, was more ecclesiastical than baronial, stone churches rather than stone castles. The Bayeux tapestry records the Conquest in thread, with a detail that has not been surpassed as a primary source. It names figures, marks moments, traces the shape of the battle from the Norman landing to Harold's death. Walter Giffard carried the banner that stood for the entire enterprise's religious legitimacy. The tapestry does not name him. He is present in the battle it depicts and absent from the record it creates, which is itself a kind of portrait of what happened to the Giffard name across the following 2 centuries. The papal banner Walter Giffard carried at Hastings has not survived. There is no stone above the ground that bears his name with certainty. The surname appears today in Welsh genealogical records, in the dedications of medieval Buckinghamshire churches, and in the occasional English village name that preserves a Norman sound no one now connects to anything. If your name is Giffard, you carry one of the oldest Norman grants in the English record, and one of the most completely forgotten. Giffard's power was vast, early, and rootless, given to a family that produced no anchor, no institution, no line that held. The name at number 6 had the opposite problem entirely. That family anchored itself with such force on such a dangerous frontier that within a single generation, the crown itself felt the weight. Number 6. Montgomery. Roger de Montgomery was trusted by William the Conqueror above almost every other commander. trusted specifically to govern Normandy while William was away conquering England. And within 30 years of the conquest, Roger's son was in open rebellion against the English crown. The name comes from Saint-Foy de Montgomery in Calvados, Normandy. Roger de Montgomery did not fight at Hastings. That absence was not a demotion. It was the highest possible mark of confidence William could express. To leave a man behind in Normandy governing the duchy while the invasion committed itself to an outcome that was not yet certain. Roger arrived in England after the battle and received what his service had earned, the earldom of Shrewsbury, placing him on the Welsh marches and extensive lands in Sussex, over 70 manors in total, primarily in Shropshire. The Welsh marches were not an ordinary English frontier. Marcher lords operated under a legal framework that existed nowhere else in the kingdom. The right to wage private war, to hold their own courts, to levy taxation without royal oversight. It was sovereignty of a specific medieval kind, licensed independence, granted because the frontier demanded men who could act faster than any royal directive could travel. Roger de Montgomery was exactly the kind of man that required. He built Shrewsbury Castle on its sandstone ridge above the River Severn and used it as the administrative center of a frontier authority that answered, in daily practice, to no one. His son Robert de Bellême inherited that authority and used it differently. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis described Robert as a man of unparalleled cruelty, even by the standards of Norman frontier lords. And those standards were not gentle. When Henry I came to the throne in 1100, the accumulated autonomy of the Montgomery earldom became a direct political problem. Robert de Bellême launched a full rebellion in 1102. It failed. Henry stripped the family of the earldom of Shrewsbury, expelled Robert from England permanently, and dismantled the Montgomery power base in a campaign that was as much constitutional assertion as military action. It was one of the first times an English king had forcibly reclaimed baronial independence granted by the conquest itself. The Montgomery name did not disappear. It moved westward into Wales and eventually across the Atlantic. Montgomery County exists in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, in Ohio, and in more than a dozen other American states, all of them carrying, without knowing it, the name of a Norman family whose English earldom lasted one generation before rebellion ended it. The town of Montgomery in Powys, Wales, still marks the western edge of where that family's ambition ran out. Shrewsbury Castle stands today, modified by centuries of subsequent use, its Norman core embedded inside later construction. The sandstone ridge above the Severn is still there. The earldom is not. Before we continue, if you are finding value in this, subscribe to Origins Archive. Every week, we trace the hidden histories buried inside surnames and family names. The next 4 entries change significantly in scale. Number 5, Ferrers. The name arrives in the English record not with a single dramatic moment, no battle, no rebellion, no constitutional crisis, but with something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing. A number, 210 manors. Henry de Ferrers crossed with the Conqueror in 1066, and by 1086, when William ordered the survey that became the Domesday Book, he held 210 manors across 14 English counties. Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Berkshire, Leicestershire. The Ferrers' landholdings spread across the English Midlands like an ink stain pressed into parchment, each entry in the survey's dense Latin columns representing a village, a mill, a stretch of arable land, a community of people who now answered to a Norman name they had never heard before the conquest. 210 manors in a single generation represented approximately 1% of all recorded landholdings in the Domesday Survey. One family, 1%. From a single channel crossing 2 decades before the ink dried. The name itself carries its origins plainly. Ferrers derives from the Norman French farrier, an ironsmith, a worker in iron, a dealer in the metal that came from the ore-rich hills of Normandy. The family's pre-conquest wealth was rooted in iron, and when that wealth translated into English land, it did so with a thoroughness that suggests the Ferrers understood very clearly what the conquest had made possible. They became Earls of Derby, the first holders of that title, and held it for over 150 years. William de Ferrers, 6th Earl of Derby, appeared among the baronial witnesses to Magna Carta in 1215, standing alongside the men who had forced King John to set his seal to the document at Runnymede. His presence there was characteristic of the Ferrers method, proximity to power without ever quite becoming its center. He switched allegiances during the subsequent civil war between John and the barons, once, then again, with the measured calculation of a family that had survived too long by instinct to commit irrevocably to any single outcome. The line ended not in battle, but in miscalculation. Robert de Ferrers, 8th Earl, made a series of political errors across the 1260s and 1270s that left him militarily defeated and politically isolated. Edward I declared the earldom of Derby forfeit in 1279 and granted it to his son Edmund. The Ferrers never recovered the title. The horseshoe on the Ferrers coat of arms, that direct inheritance from Normandy's ironworking hills, still appears on the Derby City Council crest today. A Norman smith's mark pressed into a modern English city's official emblem, visible on letterheads and civic buildings across Derbyshire, recognized by almost no one who sees it as what it is. If your surname is Ferrers or its variants Ferris or Ferrer, you carry a name that once meant 1% of England. The earldom is gone. The horseshoe remains. Ferrers measured their power in land and held it through arithmetic rather than ambition. The family at number 4 held their ground differently. Through centuries of frontier violence, and through one woman whose influence on the English crown was of a kind that no amount of land could replicate. Number 4. Clifford. Walter de Clifford raised a castle above the River Wye in the late 11th century, on a limestone promontory where the river bends south through Herefordshire toward the Welsh hills, and the family that took their name from that place held the marches, and everything the marches demanded for nearly 600 years. The Cliffords were marcher lords, a category that requires some explanation because it was unlike anything else in the English legal landscape. Marcher lords did not simply hold land near the Welsh border, they held it under a separate legal framework, one that granted them powers no English baron east of the Severn possessed. The right to wage private war without royal license, to hold their own courts with their own laws, to levy taxation independent of the crown. The frontier was too violent, too fluid, too distant from Westminster for normal feudal governance to function. The Cliffords were exactly the kind of men that required, hard, durable, and constitutionally autonomous. Walter de Clifford's granddaughter Rosamond became the mistress of Henry II around 1165. The king's preference for her over Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was not discreet. Henry kept Rosamond at court with a visibility that made the political reality of the situation plain to everyone who observed it, and Eleanor Denens Tolkien, who was not a woman who absorbed humiliation quietly, responded accordingly. The Great Rebellion of 1173, when Eleanor encouraged her own sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, to rise against their father, had several causes. The king's treatment of his queen was among them. Rosamond de Clifford had, in other words, contributed, indirectly but materially, to a rebellion that nearly destroyed the Angevin dynasty from within. Rosamond died around 1176, most likely at Godstow Nunnery near Oxford, where Henry II had her buried with a ceremony that bordered on the funerary honors of a queen. After Henry's death, Eleanor of Aquitaine was said to have had Rosamond's tomb moved outside the church walls, not destroyed but displaced. A quiet, precise, posthumous correction. The family's later history is darker. John de Clifford, called the Butcher in the Chronicles, killed the 17-year-old Edmund, Earl of Rutland, after the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, a killing Shakespeare dramatized in Henry VI Part 3 as an act of cold revenge. The Clifford reputation for frontier brutality, established over 2 centuries of Welsh marches warfare, reached its most notorious expression in a field in Yorkshire in December of that year. The barony survived until 1643, when Henry Clifford, 5th Earl of Cumberland, died without male heirs. The line that had begun on a limestone cliff above the Wye ended without ceremony, nearly 6 centuries after it started. Clifford Castle still stands above the river, or rather its walls stand, roofless, overgrown, entirely unmanaged and free to enter. No visitor center, no admission fee, no interpretation boards explaining what happened here. One of the most historically dense ruins in England and almost entirely unvisited. If your surname is Clifford, the castle above the Wye is still there. The stone is cold. The river moves below it exactly as it always has. The Cliffords exercised power at the edge of England, where the rules bent to accommodate them. The family at number 3 operated at the very center, in the Parliament, in the court, in the precise constitutional moment when the English crown itself became unstable. And their single most consequential act was something that never happened. Before we continue, if you are finding value in this, subscribe to Origins Archive. Every week we trace the hidden histories buried inside surnames and family names. The next 3 entries are where the consequences become permanent. Number 3, Mowbray. The name originates at Montbray in the Montche department of Normandy, a village whose stone and silence gave no indication in the 11th century that the family carrying its name would one day hold the premier dukedom of England and trigger the constitutional crisis that ended a dynasty. The Mowbray connection to the conquest runs through 2 distinct lines. Geoffrey de Mowbray, Bishop of Coutances, was one of William's senior ecclesiastical supporters, present at Hastings, instrumental in the legal consolidation of the conquest, and one of the most powerful churchmen in early Norman England. The secular Mowbray line that descended alongside him accumulated land across Norfolk and Yorkshire, generation by generation, until by the late 14th century the name sat at the very apex of English noble society. Thomas de Mowbray was created first Duke of Norfolk in 1386, the premier dukedom of England, a title that placed him in terms of formal precedence above every nobleman in the kingdom save the king's own sons. It was not enough to keep him safe. Thomas de Mowbray had been one of the Lords Appellant in 1387 and 1388, the coalition of magnates who forced Richard II to submit his royal household to parliamentary oversight and executed several of the king's closest advisors. He then did what made him uniquely dangerous. He switched sides, he returned to Richard's favor, distanced himself from his former allies, and in doing so created a man who trusted no one and whom no one could fully trust. When he accused Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, of treason in 1398, the accusation was credible enough that the king took it seriously, and dangerous enough that Bolingbroke could not let it stand. The resolution agreed upon was judicial combat. The 2 men would settle the matter on horseback, with lances, before the king and the assembled nobility of England. The field at Coventry was prepared. The crowd gathered. On the 16th of September, 1398, the 2 dukes faced each other across that ground, visors down, horses ready. Richard II stopped them before they charged. He exiled both men, Mowbray for life, Bolingbroke for 6 years. And in that single decision removed from England the man who would return in 1399 as Henry IV, depose Richard, and end the Plantagenet line that had held the English throne for over 2 centuries. Thomas de Mowbray died in Venice in 1399, in exile before the consequences of that Coventry afternoon had fully resolved. He never saw what his quarrel had set in motion. He never saw the throne change hands. Mowbray ranks here, at number 3, because his family's most consequential act was something that did not happen, a combat that was halted, a sentence of exile that misfired. The mechanism by which the Plantagenet dynasty ended was not a battle or a coup. It was an afternoon in a field in the English Midlands, 2 armed men brought to a halt by a king who did not understand what he had just done. The site of that field at Coventry is now occupied by a retail park. The most consequential non-event in English constitutional history unfolded on ground where, today, people push trolleys through a car park under fluorescent light, with no marker, no plaque, no indication of what the earth beneath them once witnessed. The Mowbray dukedom of Norfolk passed eventually to the Howard family, who hold it to this day. The Howard Dukes of Norfolk remain the premier dukes of England, the title the Mowbrays created, surviving in another family's hands across 6 centuries. The name Mowbray itself persists most recognizably in Melton Mowbray, Leicestershire, a market town now known principally for its pork pies and its fox hunting tradition, carrying a Norman French place name that almost no one there connects to a duke who died in Venetian exile in 1399. If your surname is Mowbray, you carry the name of a family whose single most dramatic moment was the moment they were silenced, and whose silence changed England more than most battles ever did. Mowbray's story ends in exile and absence. The family at number 2 ends differently, in cold stone, starvation, and a siege that lasted 210 days above a river in Normandy, holding the last physical remnant of a conquered world. Number 2. Lacy. The name comes from Lacy in Calvados, Normandy, a small settlement whose name now appears primarily in genealogical databases and in the occasional English churchyard, carved into stone above a family that did not know and could not have known what the name once cost to carry. The Lacy family crossed with the Conqueror and planted themselves with particular tenacity across England and later Ireland. Hugh de Lacy became Lord of Meath in the 1170s, a grant of Irish territory so vast and administered with such autonomous authority that Henry II grew alarmed at what he had created and had Hugh removed. The Lacys in Ireland became a separate dynastic question from the Lacys in England, but the underlying pattern was consistent across both. A family that accumulated power steadily, held it for longer than most, and understood that the Norman world required constant attritional defense. That attritional quality reached its defining expression in the autumn of 1203, on a limestone cliff above the river Seine at a place the French called Les Andelys, where Richard I of England had built, between 1196 and 1197, the fortress he called Château Gaillard. Richard built it in a single year. That speed was itself a statement. The castle sat on a spur of white chalk above the Seine, commanding the river approach to Rouen, defended by a series of concentric wards and a design that incorporated the lessons of Crusader fortification. Richard called it his saucy castle, a phrase that carried in medieval French something between affection and defiance. It was the last major Norman stronghold in France. When Roger de Lacy took command of its garrison, he understood precisely what it represented. In August of 1203, Philip II of France brought his army to the cliffs below Château Gaillard and began the siege. Roger de Lacy held fewer than 150 men. There was no prospect of English relief. King John had already effectively conceded Normandy as a military theater. De Lacy expelled non-combatants from the castle to preserve what food remained, a rational decision with an outcome no one fully controlled. Philip II refused to let those civilians pass through French lines. Several hundred people, men, women, and children who had sought shelter inside the walls, spent the winter of 1203 in the dry moat between the castle and the French army. Trapped, starving, the garrison above them could not feed them, the French army below them would not pass them. Historians estimate that the majority of those civilians did not survive the winter. De Lacy held on. The siege lasted from August 1203 to March 1204, approximately 210 days. When the castle finally fell, it did so not through its outer walls, which held throughout. Philip II's engineers found a different way in. They breached the inner ward through a latrine chute, a drainage opening in the castle's waste system, just wide enough for a man to pass through. Richard I's supposedly impregnable fortress, the most advanced military architecture in the Norman world, was entered through a toilet. Roger de Lacy surrendered on honorable terms. He was not executed. He returned to England, retained his lands at Pontefract in Yorkshire, and died in 1211. The name continued in England, in Ireland, and eventually across the Atlantic, where variant spellings surface in American county records, and family histories carried westward by people who knew nothing of a limestone cliff above a French river. The ruins of Château Gaillard still stand above the Seine near Les Andelys, clifftop, dramatic, and largely intact in silhouette against the sky. Pontefract Castle, the Lacy English seat, was demolished in the 17th century, but its keep survives. If your surname is Lacy, the castle above the Seine is the shape your name took at its most extreme. A garrison of fewer than 150 men, a river below them, an empire ending around them, and no relief coming. Lacy's story closes the Norman chapter in France. What comes at number 1 is the name that wrote itself most completely into England's permanent fabric, into its laws, its constitutions, its maps, and its given names, and then, on a single June afternoon in Scotland, disappeared entirely. Number 1. The Clare family crossed the Channel in 1066 and spent the next 250 years building an empire so large, so deeply embedded in English law and land, that when the last male Clare died on a Scottish battlefield in 1314, the shock of it sent reverberations through the English constitution that can still be felt today. They did not arrive as outsiders who were slowly absorbed. They arrived as conquerors, and they behaved accordingly, accumulating earldoms, crossing seas, compelling kings, and rewriting the legal fabric of two countries. No other Norman surname embedded itself so completely or left behind so much that is still in use. Richard de Clare, known to history as Strongbow, led the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1170, receiving the Kingdom of Leinster as his reward and effectively carrying the conquest across the Irish Sea. He is the reason English common law first entered Ireland. The landing at Waterford was not an accident of ambition. It was the Clare family doing what the Clare family did, identifying a vacuum of power and filling it with armed men and legal instruments. In England, the Clares held simultaneously the earldoms of Gloucester and Hertford, the largest combined landholding of any non-royal family in 13th century England. The weight of that accumulation alone would be enough to place them here. But land was only the beginning. Gilbert de Clare, 8th Earl, was among the barons who forced King John to set his seal to Magna Carta at Runnymede in June 1215. The Clare seal appears on the document that remains the foundation of English constitutional law. A Norman family, descended from men who crossed with William, helped compel an English king to acknowledge limits on his own power. The irony is precise and permanent. At the height of Clare power around 1300, the family controlled land across England, Wales, and Ireland, totaling an estimated 1/5 of all privately held noble land in the British Isles. One family, 1/5. Held not through inheritance alone, but through a century and a half of deliberate strategic accumulation. The Statute of Mortmain, passed in 1279, partly in response to the Clare family's practice of granting land to the church to evade royal feudal obligations, still forms a foundational element of English charity and land law. A statute written to constrain one family's behavior became a permanent feature of English legal architecture. The Clares provoked a law that outlasted them by 700 years. Gilbert de Clare, 9th Earl, died at the Battle of Bannockburn on the 24th of June, 1314, aged approximately 23, fighting for Edward II in the catastrophic English defeat at the hands of Robert Bruce. He left no heirs. The Clare line in the Mail ended that afternoon on a Scottish field, in the mud. Before he had lived long enough to understand the scale of what he was carrying, the name did not disappear, it fractured, it dispersed through female lines, through cadet branches, through anglicization, through the ordinary erosion of centuries. The surname Clare survives today not primarily as a noble name, but as a common English given name, Clare, 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 and as a county in Ireland, which was named after the de Clare family's landholdings along the River Fergus. The name of an obliterated Norman dynasty became one of the most commonly given names in the English-speaking world, carried daily by people who have never heard of Strongbow, who do not know what Magna Carta cost, who could not locate Bannockburn on a map. Pembroke Castle, built by the Clares, still stands. The great round keep, one of the finest Norman towers surviving in Britain, rises above the tidal water of Pembroke town, still wearing the shape the Clare masons gave it. Magna Carta, which a Clare helped compel, is held under glass in the British Library. The Statute of Mortmain, which the Clares provoked, remains on the English Statute Book. County Clare exists, its name spoken every day across Ireland and the diaspora. And the name Clare is given to children this morning in countries that have never heard of the Conquest, with no knowledge of what they are carrying forward, from Warren to Ferrers, Percy to Montgomery, Lacy to Clare. These are not simply family names, they are a map of one October afternoon in 1066 when a fleet crossed 22 miles of water and renamed a country. Each name on this list is a piece of that crossing, pressed into English soil so deeply that even 8 centuries of forgetting have not dislodged it. The safest thing the Conquest did was forget its own origins. The most honest thing we can do is remember them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Origins Archive. Next, the 10 English place names that are still speaking Norman French.